Andrew Reed had barely finished unpacking the last of his boxes when he heard the sharp, persistent knocking at his front door. The rhythmic pounding had a demanding quality, as if whoever stood outside believed they had every right to enter. Andrew sighed, setting down a framed photo of his late father, and made his way to the door, already guessing that this wouldn't be a friendly welcome from a new neighbor. He had moved into this suburban neighborhood just a week ago, hoping for some peace and quiet after years of working high-pressure cases as a police officer. But the aggressive knocking told him that trouble had found him faster than he expected. As he opened the door, he was met with the sight of a middle-aged woman standing firmly on his porch, arms crossed, lips pursed in a thin line of disapproval. She had the look of someone who considered herself a person of great power, shoulders squared, chin tilted slightly upward, an air of authority that was entirely self-imposed. Her short, platinum blonde hair was styled into a rigid bob, and she wore an immaculately pressed blouse tucked into beige slacks, the kind of outfit that screamed self-presented homeowner association enforcer. "You need to leave," she said immediately, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never been told no in her life. Andrew raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me." She let out an exaggerated sigh, as if she were dealing with a particularly slow child. "This house," she said, jabbing a manicured finger toward his doorway, "is not yours. I don't know who you think you are, but this property has already been claimed." Andrew resisted the urge to laugh. "Well, that's news to me," he replied, leaning casually against the doorframe, "because according to my mortgage and title deed, it's mine." The woman narrowed her eyes. "That's impossible. My son is supposed to move in here next month. We were promised this house." Andrew tilted his head slightly. "Promised by who?" She crossed her arms. "By me, Andrew." "Blinked by you." "That's right," she said, her voice filled with arrogance. "I oversee this neighborhood's homeowner association. I approve who gets to live here and who doesn't. There must have been a mistake with the sale. This house wasn't supposed to go on the market." Andrew sighed, already regretting this conversation. "Well, I'm not part of a homeowner association, and even if I were, they don't have the authority to control who buys a home. I bought this place legally, signed all the papers, and here I am." The woman's face twisted in frustration. "Listen," she said, her voice lowering as if she were offering him a reasonable deal. "I'm sure you don't want to cause trouble here. This is a very tight-knit community, and we like to keep things organized. My son has been waiting for this house for months. It would be best for everyone if you just—" Andrew held up a hand. "Let me stop you right there," he said. "I don't care who your son is. I bought this house fair and square. I have no plans to leave. So, unless you have an actual legal argument, I'd suggest you move along." The woman's expression darkened. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she growled. Andrew chuckled. "Lady, I've dealt with murderers, gang members, and career criminals. I think I'll survive dealing with a pushy neighbor." Her face turned red with rage. "I'll have you removed," she snapped. "You'll regret this." Andrew shrugged, looking forward to it. Without another word, the woman spun on her heel and stormed away, muttering under her breath. Andrew watched her leave, shaking his head. He had no idea just how much trouble she was about to cause. Andrew had almost forgotten about the demanding woman from the day before. Almost. But as he stepped out onto his front porch early the next morning, sipping a fresh cup of coffee and enjoying the crisp morning air, he spotted something strange on his doorstep, a large white envelope with bold red letters stamped across it, "Urgent Notice." Andrew's brows furrowed as he set his coffee mug down on the wooden railing and bent to pick up the envelope. His name wasn't on it. Instead, the letter was addressed to current occupant, as if whoever had written it didn't even recognize him as the legal owner of the property. He ripped it open, his eyes quickly scanning the contents. The letter, printed on what looked like official homeowner association stationery, contained a notice demanding that he vacate the property within 7 days due to an alleged illegal occupancy. The document claimed that he had violated community regulations and that his home had been erroneously sold due to a clerical error. The final paragraph threatened that if he did not comply, the homeowner association would take further actions to remove him. Andrew let out a dry chuckle. This is a joke. His gaze dropped to the bottom of the letter, where he found the signature Karen Mitchell, homeowner association president, exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. She's really trying this. Andrew knew enough about homeowner associations to recognize a blatant scheme when he saw one. He wasn't even a part of a homeowner association. His home wasn't under any rule that allowed an association to dictate terms to him. Karen had no authority to evict him, let alone issue legal threats. This was nothing more than an intimidation trick. He wasn't intimidated. With a smirk, Andrew crumpled up the letter and tossed it into the bin near his porch. He had dealt with far worse threats in his career. He had barely stepped back inside when the knocking came again. This time, it was even louder, more forceful. Andrew sighed, already knowing who it was. When he opened the door, sure enough, Karen stood there, arms crossed, her expression twisted into one of self-righteous rage. "Good morning, Karen," Andrew said, leaning against the doorframe. "I just got your little letter. Really cute stuff, but I'm afraid I won't be going anywhere." Karen's lips thinned. "This is no joke, Mr. Reed," she snapped. "You are trespassing on community land. If you do not vacate voluntarily, I will have no choice but to escalate this matter legally." Andrew raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and how exactly do you plan on doing that?" "I've already spoken with my attorney," she declared, lifting her chin. "I have proof that this house was never meant to be sold outside of homeowner association approval. Your purchase is invalid." Andrew let out a short laugh. "Karen, I don't think you understand how real estate laws work. I bought this house legally. My name is on the deed. The sale is final. There's no rule saying I needed approval from the homeowner association. Because now pay attention here. I am not part of your homeowner association." Karen's expression darkened. "This is a private area," she hissed. "We have rules, Mr. Reed, and I will not let some outsider come in and destroy the order of our neighborhood." Andrew shook his head. "You don't own this neighborhood, Karen." Karen's nostrils flared. "I have lived here for 20 years. I have personally approved every single homeowner on this street, and I am not about to let some random man take over the house. I set aside for my son." "Set aside?" Andrew repeated, his amusement fading. "So that's what this is really about. You thought you had a claim to this house because you wanted it for your son, and now that it didn't go your way, you're trying to bully me into leaving." Karen's face tightened. Andrew crossed his arms. "Well, that's not happening." Karen's eyes flashed. "I will make your life miserable," she spat. "I will file complaints. I will have you fined for every single violation I can find. Your lawn, your mailbox, your fence. I will bury you in violations until you can't stand to live here anymore." Andrew's smirk returned. "Karen, I don't think you did your homework before pulling this move. I am the law. You think your little homeowner association complaints scare me, lady? I've been in actual dangerous situations. You filing fake violations doesn't even make my top 10 list of concerns." Karen's fists clenched. "You're making a huge mistake," she growled. "You will regret this." Andrew took a slow sip of his coffee, giving her a long, unimpressed look. "We'll see about that." Karen glared at him for a few more seconds, then turned sharply on her heel and stormed off down the driveway, her shoes clicking angrily against the pavement. Andrew watched her go, waiting until she disappeared from view before exhaling through his nose. He had a feeling this was only the start. Andrew Reed had barely stepped out onto his porch that evening when he noticed something odd across the street. A small group of people had gathered in front of Karen Mitchell's house. Their voices carried in the cool evening air low murmurs of conversation mixed with the occasional raised remark. Andrew didn't need to guess what they were talking about. Since Karen's threats that morning, he had been expecting some kind of trouble. People like her didn't just accept defeat. They found new ways to push their agenda, especially when they believed they had influence. Andrew took a slow sip of his coffee, leaning against the railing as he watched Karen animatedly speak to the growing crowd she was gathering, the neighbors. From his experience as a cop, Andrew knew exactly what this was: an attempt to turn public opinion against him. She wanted to paint him as an outsider, someone who didn't belong. She was hoping that if she couldn't legally force him out, she could make his life so unbearable that he'd leave on his own. Andrew sighed. He had seen group mentality before, but this was a new level. Before he could head inside, the murmurs became shouts. The small crowd was now making their way across the street toward his house. Karen led the charge, her expression a mask of smug certainty. A few of the neighbors behind her looked hesitant, but they still followed, caught up in whatever lies she had been feeding them. Andrew set his coffee down on the porch railing and crossed his arms. He wasn't going to be intimidated by a bunch of locals, Mr. Reed. Karen's voice rang out sharply as she reached the bottom of his steps. We need to talk. Andrew raised an eyebrow. We, or just you? Karen's smirk widened. We, as in the community, the people who actually belong here. Andrew glanced at the group behind her. He recognized some of the faces, people who had barely acknowledged him since he moved in. Others were strangers, clearly taking Karen's word at value. He could see the uncertainty in some of their eyes, the way they shifted uncomfortably, as if they weren't quite sure what they had signed up for. I wasn't aware I needed permission to exist in my own house, Andrew said dryly. Karen took a step closer. You stole this house, Mr. Reed. You know it, and everyone here knows it. Andrew let out a short laugh. That's funny, because I distinctly remember buying it. Karen's smile flickered, but she quickly regained her composure. You're an outsider. This isn't your home. We've decided, she gestured to the people behind her, that you need to leave. Andrew tilted his head. You've decided? That's cute. But last I checked, this isn't communist Russia. You don't get to just take people's property because you decide you need it. A few neighbors shifted uneasily, clearly not expecting Andrew to push back so hard. Karen's jaw tightened. You're making this worse. Andrew gave her a long, unimpressed look. Karen, you showed up at my house with a bunch of people, expecting me to what? Just hand you the keys because you feel entitled to them. Don't be foolish, she snapped. We're giving you a chance to do the right thing before this gets bad. Andrew narrowed his eyes. There was something about the way she said that, calm, but laced with veiled threats. I don't respond well to threats, he said. That wasn't a threat, Karen said sweetly. It was a warning. Andrew stared at her. He could feel the tension in the air, the way the group behind her waited to see what would happen next. It was clear that some of them had been dragged into this unwillingly, but Karen wasn't giving them an out. Then something in her snapped without warning. She lunged forward and hit him across the face. It wasn't a light tap, either. It was a full force, open palm slap, the sharp sound of impact ringing through the street. The crowd gasped. One woman covered her mouth. Another man muttered something under his breath. Andrew barely reacted. He had taken worse hits in his first month as a cop. Slowly, he turned his head back to face her. Karen's face was red with anger, her breathing heavy. She had expected a reaction, maybe for him to yell, to flinch, to show any kind of weakness, but Andrew just smirked. Assaulting an officer, he said, his voice dangerously calm. Karen, that's a bold move. Karen's expression faltered. Andrew reached into his pocket and pulled out his ID. And just like that, the power dynamic shifted. The smugness drained from Karen's face as the realization hit her. The neighbors behind her looked at each other, suddenly uncomfortable, suddenly very aware that they had been dragged into something much bigger than they signed up for. Andrew let the silence stretch, letting her stew in her own fear. You didn't think to check who I was before pulling this little act? He asked. Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Andrew exhaled through his nose. Let me explain. What happens next? He said. You just physically assaulted a police officer, which means I could arrest you right now. Karen's face went pale. But I'm a reasonable man, Andrew continued, so I'm going to give you a choice. Either you and your little mob turn around and go back to your houses like nothing ever happened, or I put you in handcuffs right here on your own front yard. Silence. Andrew could see the panic setting in. Karen's hands twitched at her sides. She was trapped, and she knew it. The neighbors had already started backing away. A man in the back cleared his throat. I think this has gone far enough, he mumbled. A few others nodded quickly. Karen turned on them. You're all just going to let him stay? After everything? Yeah, we are. Someone interrupted. Because unlike you, we don't want to get arrested. Karen looked betrayed, but there was nothing she could do. The power she had over these people evaporated in an instant. Andrew took a step forward, lowering his voice, so only she could hear I meant what I said. Karen, this ends now. You try anything else, and I promise you, you will suffer. Karen's mouth twisted, but she said nothing. One by one, the neighbors left. Karen stood there, alone, shaking with rage, before finally storming back to her house. Andrew picked up his coffee mug, took a slow sip, and smiled. He wasn't going anywhere. Andrew Reed didn't expect Karen Mitchell to back down so easily. She had taken a massive hit to her ego after that slap incident, and people like her, entitled, manipulative, power-hungry, didn't just walk away from a fight. They regrouped, they plotted, and then they came back harder. So when Andrew found himself being woken up at 6 o'clock a.m. by a loud, constant banging on his front door, he wasn't surprised. Annoyed, sure, but surprised not at all. Rolling out of bed, he threw on a t-shirt and made his way downstairs, already knowing who would be standing outside. He barely had time to unlock the door before the pounding resumed. When he pulled it open, he was greeted by two uniformed sheriff's deputies standing on his porch, their faces unreadable and standing just behind them, arms folded and lips curled into a smug smile, was Karen Mitchell. Andrew's expression remained neutral. "Morning, gentlemen," he greeted casually. "Something I can help you with?" One of the deputies, a tall man with a neatly trimmed mustache, cleared his throat. "Sir, we received a report that you are illegally occupying this property." Andrew blinked. "I see," he said. Then, after a beat, "And who exactly made that report?" Karen stepped forward before either deputy could answer. "I did," she announced, the victorious glow in her eyes unmistakable. "This man is trespassing. He has no legal right to be here." Andrew let out a slow breath, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Karen, we've been over this." The deputy raised a hand, cutting him off. "Sir, do you have proof of ownership?" Andrew studied the officers for a moment, noting that neither of them seemed particularly interested about being here. They were just following up on a complaint. Karen, however, was beaming, convinced that she had finally won. Without a word, Andrew turned, walked inside, and returned a moment later. With his ownership deed, purchase contract, and mortgage documents, he handed them over to the mustached deputy, who took his time flipping through them. Andrew watched as the man's brows furrowed deeper with every page. The second officer, a younger guy, peeked over his shoulder. After a solid minute of silence, the mustached deputy let out a sigh and turned to Karen. "Ma'am, these documents are legit. Mr. Reed is the legal owner of this house." Karen's smile twitched. "No, that's not possible," she snapped. "He was never approved by the homeowner association. His purchase was a mistake." "I already told you, ma'am," the deputy interrupted, his patience wearing thin. "A homeowner association has zero authority over private home sales unless there are contractual obligations stating otherwise. And according to these records, this property was never part of a homeowner association to begin with." Karen's face twisted in frustration. But he doesn't belong here." The younger officer raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, are you seriously trying to have a homeowner arrested for living in his own place?" Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She had been so sure this would work. She had called the police, expecting them to drag Andrew out in handcuffs, enjoying the satisfaction of seeing him humiliated. Instead, she was the one being shut down. The mustached deputy sighed. "Mr. Reed, I apologize for the disturbance. You're clearly in the right here." He handed the documents back. "No problem, Deputy Andrew," said with a smirk. "I had a feeling this would happen." The officer turned back to Karen. "Ma'am, I strongly suggest you stop wasting law enforcement's time with false reports. If you file another knowingly fraudulent police report, you could be charged with filing a false complaint." Karen's face went pale. Andrew couldn't help himself. "You know," he said, his tone mockingly casual, "I could also press charges for harassment. That slap you gave me the other day. Yeah, I let that slide once. But calling the cops on me? That's strike two. Karen took a step back. You wouldn't. Andrew shrugged. Try me. The younger officer smirked slightly, but quickly masked it. Anything else, ma'am? Karen didn't answer. She was already backing away, her face contorted with rage and humiliation. She turned on her heel and stormed off, practically running back to her house. The deputies exchanged a glance before nodding to Andrew. Have a good day, sir. Oh, I definitely will, Andrew said, watching Karen disappear as soon as the officers left. Andrew leaned against his doorframe, letting out a small chuckle. Karen had tried to get him arrested. She had called the cops on him, and now she was out of ideas. Or so he thought, because the next day things got worse. Andrew Reed had thought that after Karen's humiliating defeat with the sheriff's deputies, she would finally accept reality and move on. But as someone who had spent years dealing with people who refused to take blame for their own failures, he should have known better. The real battle hadn't ended. It was just starting. The next morning, Andrew woke up to something strange. His water was off. At first, he thought it might be a routine maintenance issue, but when he checked his mailbox, he found a bright red notice taped to the front door. Notice of utility termination. Due to non-compliance with community rules, the homeowner of this house has been deemed ineligible for continued water service. Please contact the homeowner association for assistance. Andrew stared at the paper for a long moment before laughing out loud. Karen had really cut off his water, except she had no legal power to do that. Andrew pulled out his phone and called the local water utility company. After sitting through an agonizing hold time, he finally got an operator. Yeah, hi. He said my water got shut off, and I'm looking at a notice that says it was done by the homeowner association. Pretty sure that's illegal. The woman on the other end of the line sounded confused. Sir, your account is in good standing. We don't work with homeowner association groups for service interruptions. Andrew smirked. That's what I thought. So any chance you can turn it back on? Absolutely, the woman said. I'll dispatch someone within the hour, and if you'd like, I can forward this incident to our legal department. Homeowner associations aren't allowed to interfere with utility services. That'd be great, Andrew said, still grinning. Less than an hour later, a utility worker showed up and restored Andrew's water with no issues. But now Karen had made a critical mistake. She had interfered with city services. That wasn't just petty harassment. That was a crime. Andrew wasted no time filing a report with the city's public works department. And since he was feeling generous, he also reported her to the state housing authority for harassment. Karen was about to learn a very important lesson. When you push too hard, eventually, the law pushes back. That evening, just as Andrew was settling down for a quiet night, he heard something outside. When he looked through his window, he saw a tow truck pulling up to his driveway. Andrew's first thought was confusion. He hadn't called for a tow, but when he stepped outside, he saw Karen standing next to the driver, her arms folded and a satisfied smirk on her face. Remove the vehicle, Karen instructed the tow truck driver. The man hesitated. Ma'am, I was told this was an unauthorized vehicle. It is unauthorized, Karen snapped. It violates homeowner association parking rules. Andrew let out a low breath and pinched the bridge of his nose. Karen, I'm not in your homeowner association. Karen crossed her arms. All properties in this neighborhood are subject to homeowner association authority. Andrew let out a slow, amused sigh. All right, he said, pulling out his phone. I've had enough of this. Karen scoffed. You can call whoever you want. The board has already agreed. But then Andrew held up his phone, so she could see the screen. Hey, Mike, he said into the receiver. Yeah, I've got a problem here. Homeowner association president is trying to illegally tow my car from my own driveway. You mind swinging by? There was a pause before a familiar voice replied. Be there in 5. Karen frowned. Who's Mike? Andrew grinned. That would be Sheriff Mike Grayson. You remember him, right? The guy whose time you wasted with your fake trespassing claim. Karen's face went pale. The tow truck driver looked between them, suddenly less sure about what he was doing. "Ma'am, do you have an official court order to tow this vehicle?" Karen hesitated, because if not, the man continued, this would be vehicle theft. Andrew's smirk grew wider. "You sure you want to go through with this, Karen?" Her eyes darted around as if looking for help. But this time, no neighbors had gathered to back her up. She had alienated everyone. Then the unmistakable sound of sirens filled the air. A sheriff's cruiser pulled up and Mike Grayson stepped out, his gaze settling on Karen. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I'm going to need you to explain why you're illegally trying to have this man's car towed." Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. Andrew chuckled. "Yeah, I'd love to hear this one too." Mike sighed and looked at the tow truck driver. "Sir, you're free to go. There's no legal basis for this tow." The driver did not hesitate. He turned back to his truck, eager to get out of this mess. As the tow truck pulled away, Mike turned his attention fully to Karen. "Ma'am, this is your second time making a false legal claim against Mr. Reed. And from what I hear, you've also interfered with city utilities." Karen took a step back. I was just enforcing the community standards." Mike didn't look impressed. "Karen Mitchell, you're under arrest for filing a false police report, attempted vehicle theft, and tampering with city property." Andrew folded his arms as he watched the scene unfold. Wait. Karen shrieked as the deputies pulled out handcuffs. "This isn't fair. He's the one who doesn't belong here." Andrew smirked. "Well, Karen, I guess the law disagrees." As they secured the cuffs around her wrists, Karen screamed, "You'll pay for this. You'll all regret this." Mike sighed. "Ma'am, please remain calm." Karen did not remain silent. She kicked, she shouted, she flung insults at everyone nearby. But in the end, it didn't matter. They put her in the back of the cruiser, closed the door, and just like that, the queen of the homeowner association had fallen. In the days that followed, things quieted down. The city launched an official review into Karen's actions. It turned out she had been faking homeowner association control for years. There was no actual homeowner association governing the area. She had been scamming homeowners for illegal fees, bullying people into compliance, and attempting to control real estate deals. When the truth came out, her entire scheme collapsed. Andrew stayed right where he was. His neighbors, many of whom had been too scared to speak up, finally started warming up to him. A few even apologized for believing Karen's stories. One afternoon, an elderly woman from down the street stopped by with a plate of cookies. "Thank you," she said softly, "for standing up to her. We should have done it a long time ago." Andrew just smiled, glad to assist. And as he sat on his porch drinking coffee, watching the sunset over his home, he knew one thing for certain: Karen Mitchell wasn't coming back.